Sir, the ID in her purse doesn't say Sutton Caldwell. It says Mrs. Sutton Gallagher. And her emergency contact isn't you." The hospital admitting clerk slid the plastic card across the metal counter. It made a quiet scraping sound. I was 34. Still wearing my blue radiology scrubs, smelling like hospital bleach and stale coffee. My wife of 6 years was bleeding in room 4B after a car crash on I-25. I had driven 90 miles an hour through blinding Denver snow to get here. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. "There's a man in the waiting room claiming to be her husband," the clerk added, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "He says he was driving the car when they hit the ice." 5 minutes later, I walked down the fluorescent-lit hallway and saw him. He was sitting in a plastic chair, holding a bloody rag to his forehead, and he was wearing my winter coat. The heavy North Face Parka Sutton told me she had donated to Goodwill 3 months ago. He looked up at me. I looked at him. He had no idea I was the one holding the legal medical proxy. He had no idea I was the only person who could authorize her emergency surgery. And my wife, lying unconscious behind those double doors, had absolutely no idea what I was about to do. But by then, it was way too late. My name is Vance. I take pictures of broken bones for a living. I'm a radiology technician at a clinic in downtown Denver. It's a quiet job. You put people in a machine, you tell them to hold their breath, and you look right through them to see where the fracture is. You learn a lot about people by how they react to being broken. Some cry, some get angry, some just go perfectly still. I've always been the still kind. I grew up in a house where noise was dangerous. My father, Arthur, was a hard man. Not physically violent, but his words could peel the paint off a wall. If you argued, you lost. If you yelled, you lost faster. My grandfather, who lived in the basement apartment beneath us, was the only one who understood how to survive in that house. He used to sit on his porch, whittling blocks of pine, watching my father rage over a lawnmower that wouldn't start. My grandfather would just shake his head, look at me, and say his one piece of advice: "A cornered dog doesn't bark, Vance, it just waits for the teeth to align." I didn't fully understand what that meant until I was 34 years old, staring at a man wearing my stolen coat in an emergency room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That detail, the coat, the fake ID, the hospital, remember it. It's the reason this story ends with a woman screaming in a lawyer's office while I drank a very expensive glass of bourbon. I met Sutton when I was 28. She was a pharmaceutical rep who came into my clinic to pitch a new contrast dye. She had this dark, sleek hair, eyes the color of black coffee, and a laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room who understood the joke. She was magnetic, the kind of woman who walks into a room and completely rearranges the center of gravity. I was just a tech in scrubs. I figured she wouldn't look at me twice. But she did. She looked at me, she smiled, and 3 days later, we were sitting in a booth at a steakhouse, talking until the waiters started putting the chairs on the tables. I thought I had found my person. I thought I had won the lottery. God, I was an idiot. Looking back, the red flags weren't just waving. They were draped over my head like a circus tent, but when you're lonely, and someone that beautiful tells you you're exactly what they've been looking for, you don't check the math. You just sign the contract. We had good times. Really good times. I can still close my eyes and feel the exact texture of those early days. A sensory tapestry so rich it almost makes my chest ache to recall it. I remember driving up to Estes Park in late October of our first year together. I was driving my old Toyota Tacoma. The heater core in that truck had a tiny leak, so the cab always smelled faintly of sweet antifreeze and old leather. We had the windows rolled down despite the chill, letting in that sharp, aggressive mountain air. It was the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and smells intensely of crushed pine needles, damp granite, and the ozone of an incoming snowstorm. Sutton had her bare feet propped up on the dashboard, her toes painted a deep, glossy crimson. She was tapping her foot against the glass, singing off-key to some indie rock song playing through the blown-out passenger side speaker. The wind was whipping her dark hair across her face in wild, chaotic strands. Every few miles she would turn to look at me, her eyes so bright and dilated they practically hummed with electricity. She reached across the center console and intertwined her fingers with mine. Her skin was always so warm, radiating a kind of feverish energy. I remember the exact friction of her thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. It felt like an anchor. It felt like I had finally arrived somewhere safe. We stayed in a cheap, drafty A-frame cabin off Highway 34. The place smelled of decades-old wood smoke and mothballs. I remember the rough, scratchy texture of the cheap wool blankets on the bed, and the sharp, sulfuric tang of the matches we used to light the wood-burning stove. We spent the entire weekend wrapped in those blankets, listening to the wind rattle the single-pane windows, drinking cheap red wine out of plastic cups that left a purple ring around her lips. Then there were the Sunday afternoons in our tiny first apartment in Cap Hill. The kitchen was a cramped galley with peeling yellow linoleum and a temperamental electric stove. Once a month, she would insist on making her world-famous chili, which was less of a culinary endeavor and more of a catastrophic war against the kitchen. I can still smell it with perfect clarity. The sharp, acrid sting of scorched, crushed tomatoes hitting the bottom of a pan that was entirely too hot. The heavy, suffocating cloud of cheap cumin that hung in the air for days afterward. The metallic, burning dust smell of the electric coils glowing bright orange. Invariably, the smoke alarm would trigger. It was a piercing, rhythmic stab of sound that vibrated right behind your eyeballs and sent the neighbor's golden retriever into a barking frenzy through the thin drywall. We'd be scrambling, waving damp, threadbare dish towels in the air, our eyes watering and stinging from the smoke. She would be laughing so hard she couldn't breathe, a deep, uninhibited belly laugh that made me laugh until my ribs physically ached. I would walk up behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist, feeling the soft, worn cotton of her oversized college t-shirt. I'd bury my face in the crook of her neck. Beneath the heavy smell of burnt onions and cumin, she always smelled like vanilla lotion and rain. It was intoxicating. It was the smell of home. And she used to leave sticky notes on my bathroom mirror, little neon pink and yellow squares of paper. I can still hear the specific, dry crinkle of the paper as I pulled them off the glass. She used a heavy, blue, ballpoint pen, pressing so hard into the paper that you could feel the indented cursive letters on the back of the note like braille. Little things. You're my rock. I feel safe with you. Can't wait to see you tonight. I kept every single one of those notes in an old New Balance shoebox in the top of my closet. Every time I opened the box to add a new one, I would be hit by the smell of cardboard, glue, and the faint, dusty scent of the dried ink. I treated that box like a reliquary. I found out later she bought those sticky notes in bulk from a supply store downtown, and I wasn't the only one getting them. The fracture didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping rot. It started around our 3rd anniversary. The phone behavior changed first. You know the drill. Her phone used to live on the kitchen counter, face up, buzzing with emails. Suddenly it was living in her pocket. If she set it down, it was face down. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd lock the screen so fast she nearly dropped the device. I asked her about it once, just casually while I was washing dishes. Everything okay at work? I asked. You seem glued to the screen lately. She didn't just deny it. She attacked. Are you monitoring me, Vance? She snapped, her voice turning to ice. Because I spend all day dealing with doctors who think they own my time, and I really don't need my husband acting like a parole officer when I get home. I backed off. I told myself it was work stress. It wasn't work stress. Then came the passwords. The sudden change to the iPad code, the new lock on her laptop. When I asked to borrow her tablet to look up a recipe, she snatched it out of my hands. I have HIPAA-compliant client data on here, Vance. You can't just go snooping. Use your own phone. I had no reason not to believe her, but my stomach dropped. That cold, hollow feeling that tells you the ground you're standing on isn't solid anymore. The first real crack, the one I couldn't ignore, happened on a Thursday night. I was doing laundry. I pulled her jeans out of the hamper to check the pockets before washing them. I pulled out a crumpled receipt from a high-end men's boutique in Cherry Creek. It was for a $500 cashmere sweater. Size large. I wear a medium, and I don't own cashmere. When I confronted her, she didn't even blink. She had the emotional range of a parking meter. It's for my boss, Vance, she said, rolling her eyes. It's his retirement gift from the regional team. I was tasked with picking it up. Do you honestly think I'd buy you a $500 sweater to wear to a hospital where people throw up on you? It was the first time she had insulted my job to my face. The sting of it caught me off guard. You didn't have to say it like that, I said quietly. Then don't accuse me of things, she fired back, turning her back on me to pour a glass of wine. If I could go back to that kitchen, I would have packed my bags right then. But I stayed. Because I loved her, and because I was terrified of being as alone as my father was. And that's how I gave her permission to slowly dismantle my life. The escalation began 3 months later. Once she realized I wasn't going to leave after the sweater incident, the mask didn't just slip. She took it off and threw it in the trash. It started with public disrespect. Small, cutting remarks designed to make me feel small in front of other people. We were at a dinner party hosted by her friend, a plastic surgeon named Marcus. Everyone around the table was talking about their investment portfolios, their summer homes, their massive bonuses. I was quiet, enjoying my steak. Marcus looked across the table at me. So, Vance, how are things in the bone-snapping business? I smiled politely. Good. We just upgraded our MRI machines, so the imaging is incredibly... He pushes buttons, Sutton interrupted loudly. The entire table went silent. She took a slow sip of her martini, not looking at me. He tells people to hold still, and he pushes a button. It's not exactly rocket science, Marcus. Don't let him bore you with the technical specs. The humiliation burned the back of my neck. I looked at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to laugh and say she was joking. She just stared right through me. I do a little more than push buttons, Sutton, I said, my voice tight. Right, she sighed. You also hand out the lead aprons. Right, fascinating stuff. The table chuckled nervously and moved on. I sat there for another 2 hours, chewing food that tasted like ash. When we got in the car to go home, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped. What the hell was that? I asked. Oh, grow up, Vance, she snapped, scrolling on her phone. They're high-level professionals. They don't care about your little X-ray clinic. I was saving you from embarrassing yourself. That was beat 1. The disrespect. Beat 2 was the control. She decided that my truck, the reliable Toyota Tacoma I had owned since college, the one from our first trip to Estes Park, was an eyesore in our driveway. One morning I woke up to find the truck gone. I panicked, thinking it was stolen. I ran into the kitchen. Sutton was drinking coffee, completely calm. Where's my truck? I demanded. I gave it to my brother, she said without looking up. He needed a vehicle for his landscaping business. I left you the keys to the old Honda in the garage. It gets better gas mileage anyway. You gave away my truck? I shouted. Without asking me? You're being dramatic, she said, finally looking at me with pure disdain. Your name is on the title, but we're married. What's yours is mine, and my brother needed it. If you want to be selfish, go call the police on your own brother-in-law. See how that makes you look. She had trapped me. If I called the cops, I was the villain destroying her family. I took the keys to the beat-up Honda. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Beat 3 was the spatial violation, the complete invasion of whatever safe space I had left. I worked a 4-day on, 3-day off rotation. Often I worked 12-hour shifts. One Tuesday, I came home exhausted, smelling like sanitizer, just wanting to sleep. I walked into our bedroom. The bed had been completely replaced, the mattress, the frame, the sheets, everything. And lying on the nightstand, my nightstand, was a silver Rolex watch. I stood in the doorway staring at it. I don't own a Rolex. I couldn't afford a Rolex if I sold a kidney. Sutton walked out of the master bathroom wearing a silk robe, towel drying her hair. She froze when she saw me looking at the watch, just for a split second. Then the smooth, practiced lie slid perfectly into place. What is this? I asked, pointing to the watch. It's a replica, she said smoothly, walking over and snatching it off the table. My boss left it in my car after client lunch. I brought it inside so it wouldn't get stolen, and before you start whining about the bed, the old one was hurting my back. I bought this one today. You bought a new bed in 4 hours? I'm efficient, Vance. Try it sometime. I knew she was lying. The air in the room felt heavy, tainted. I could smell a faint trace of cologne in the sheets. Not my cologne. The same scent that had been on her scarf months ago. But I had no proof. Just a watch she claimed was a fake, and a new bed she bought with her own money. I was losing my mind. I started checking the trash for receipts. I started checking the mileage on her car. I was becoming pathetic. Then came Beat 4, the Ally attack. Sutton's mother, Blythe, was a terrifying woman. She wore too much jewelry, drank too much Chardonnay, and treated everyone like the help. She came over for Sunday brunch. Sutton was in the shower. I was in the kitchen, cooking eggs. Blythe leaned against the counter, swirling her wine glass at 11 in the morning. You know, Vance, Blythe said, her voice dripping with condescension. I told Sutton not to marry you. I kept scrambling the eggs. Good morning to you too, Blythe. I'm serious, she continued. You don't challenge her. You don't elevate her. She's a Ferrari, and you're that tragic little Honda in the driveway. You should be down on your knees thanking God every day that she comes home to you. Because frankly, she has options. Every day, much better options. I stopped stirring. I looked at Blythe. Her eyes were hard, cruel, and completely devoid of pity. She knew. Whatever Sutton was doing, Blythe knew about it, and she approved. I'll keep that in mind, I said quietly. Beat 5 was the social starvation. The deliberate surgical isolation from anyone who might remind me of who I used to be or offer me a lifeline outside of her control. I had a friend from the clinic named Greg. He was a senior MRI technician, a loud, jovial ex-Navy guy who had mentored me when I first started. Greg was the only person who still made me laugh the way I used to. He and his wife, Sarah, invited us over for a backyard barbecue on a Saturday night in late August. I hadn't seen them outside of the hospital basement in over a year. I had been looking forward to it all week. I had even gone to a specialty wine shop and bought a $75 bottle of Cabernet to bring as a gift. I remember the heavy, dark glass of the bottle, the gold foil wrapping around the cork, the way it felt like a ticket back to normalcy. At 6 o'clock, I was standing in the hallway, wearing a clean button-down shirt and my best jeans, holding the wine. Sutton was still in her bathrobe, sitting on the living room couch, methodically filing her nails. The television was off. The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, scraping shh of the emery board against her thumbnail. "We need to leave in 10 minutes, I said, checking my watch. She didn't look up. She didn't break the rhythm of the file. "I'm not going." I lowered the bottle of wine, my stomach dropping. "What do you mean you're not going?" "We RSVP'd 3 weeks ago. Sarah has been marinating the brisket for 2 days. "I have a headache," she said, blowing a fine dusting of white powder off her thumb. "And frankly, Vance, I don't want to spend my Saturday night making forced conversation with a man who talks about contrast dye and bone density for 3 hours. It's depressing. His wife is even worse. She sells essential oils on Facebook. I'm not subjecting myself to that." "Greg is my friend, Sutton. You promised me we would go. You said it yesterday." She finally stopped filing. She looked up at me, her eyes flat, dead, and entirely devoid of empathy. "And I'm your wife. I said I'm not going. If you want to abandon your sick wife to go eat cheap meat in a mosquito-infested backyard with a glorified button pusher, go ahead. But don't expect me to be here when you get back." My heart started hammering against my ribs, a fast, frantic rhythm of pure panic. "Wait, are you threatening to leave me over a barbecue?" "I'm stating a boundary," she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, clinical therapy speak tone she used when she wanted to make me feel insane. "You're being incredibly aggressive right now, Vance. You're hovering over me with a heavy glass bottle, raising your voice because I don't feel well. It's actually terrifying. I don't feel safe when you act like this." I stared at her. I was standing 10 feet away. I hadn't raised my voice above a conversational level, but the way she said it, so calmly, so convicted, looking at me like I was a feral animal, made the room spin. It was a masterclass in reality distortion. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "I'm not being aggressive," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm standing by the front door. I just want to see my friend." "You don't care about my well-being at all, do you?" she whispered, leaning back into the cushions, her eyes welling up with perfectly timed tears. "I work 60-hour weeks to pay for the lifestyle you enjoy. I come home exhausted and physically ill, and you scream at me because I won't go perform for your little work friends. You are so profoundly selfish, Vance. It's sickening." She was rewriting history in real time. She was the breadwinner, yes, but I paid half the mortgage. I did all the cooking. I did all the laundry. Yet in her narrative, I was a parasitic abuser, holding a glass bottle like a weapon. The sheer audacity of the lie paralyzed me. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to list the chores I'd done that morning, to point out she was perfectly fine an hour ago when she was laughing on the phone with her mother. But the words wouldn't come. I was drowning in her funhouse mirror. "Go," she whispered, turning her face away from me, letting one single tear fall down her cheek. "Go tell Greg how much more important he is than your marriage, but we both know you won't, because you know how toxic you're being." She was right. I didn't go. I texted Greg and told him Sutton had severe food poisoning. I put the $75 bottle of wine back in the dark cupboard above the fridge. I took off my button-down shirt, put my gray sweatpants back on, and sat in the dark kitchen for 3 hours. The house was silent except for the sound of the television in the living room. She had turned on a romantic comedy. I sat there in the dark, listening to her laugh at all the jokes, eating a bowl of popcorn she had just popped in the microwave. Her headache had magically vanished the moment I capitulated. She had successfully severed my last real connection to the outside world, and she hadn't even had to raise her voice to do it. Beat 6 was the institutional threat. The arguments were getting worse. One night, after I found a hotel room keycard in her gym bag, the fight escalated. I confronted her in the living room. "Who is he?" I demanded, holding up the plastic card. "Just tell me the truth, Sutton." She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She walked over to the fireplace, picked up a heavy glass vase, and smashed it directly into her own forehead. The glass shattered. A cut opened above her eyebrow, bleeding down her face. I froze in absolute horror. She calmly picked up her phone, dialed 3 numbers, and hovered her thumb over the call button. "Here's what happens now, Vance," she whispered, blood dripping down her cheek. "You are going to put that key card in the trash. You are going to go sleep in the guest room. If you ever question me again, I press this button. I tell the 911 operator my husband just smashed a vase over my head because he's paranoid and abusive. Who do you think they'll believe? The successful pharmaceutical rep or the creepy X-ray tech with a temper?" I stared at her. I wasn't looking at my wife anymore. I was looking at a monster. I dropped the key card. I walked to the guest room. I locked the door. That was the night the quiet click happened in my brain. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stopped being a victim and I started being a strategist. But before I could execute anything, she delivered beat 7. The cruelest moment, the one that almost broke me. It was mid-January. Denver was getting hit with a massive blizzard. Temperatures were hovering around 8 degrees. The wind was howling off the mountains, rattling the windows. Sutton was sitting by the fireplace, drinking wine, texting rapidly on her phone. She looked up at me. "The fire's dying. Go get more wood from the shed." I was wearing sweatpants and a thin gray t-shirt. "Let me grab my coat," I said. "It's 20 feet away, Vance. Don't be a baby. Just go grab it." I sighed, put on my boots, and walked out the back door. The cold hit me like a physical punch. The wind bit through my t-shirt instantly. I jogged to the shed, grabbed 4 heavy logs of firewood, and hurried back to the house. I reached for the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. I tried again. Locked. I knocked on the glass pane. "Sutton, open the door." Nothing. I dropped the wood. I banged on the door harder. "Sutton, it's freezing! Open the door!" Through the glass, I saw her walk into the kitchen. She was holding her phone to her ear. She looked directly at me. She smiled, a slow, cruel, deliberate smile. Then she mouthed 3 words to me through the glass. "Wait your turn." She turned around and walked out of the room, still talking on the phone. The panic set in. It was 8 degrees. I had no coat, no phone, no keys. The garage was locked. The front door was locked. The wind was slicing through my thin shirt like razors. My teeth started chattering violently within 3 minutes. I ran back to the wooden shed. It wasn't heated, but it blocked the wind. I huddled in the corner, pulling my arms inside my t-shirt, shivering so hard my ribs ached. I sat in that freezing dark for 2 hours. 120 minutes of agonizing, bone-deep cold. I thought about breaking a window, but if I did, she would call the police. She would say I went crazy and tried to break in. She had the cut on her forehead from the vase. She had the narrative, so I sat in the dark, freezing, and I let the cold burn every last ounce of love I had for her out of my system. When she finally unlocked the back door 2 hours later, I was borderline hypothermic. My lips were blue. I stumbled inside, shaking uncontrollably. She was sitting on the couch watching a movie. She didn't even look up. If you track snow on the rug, you're cleaning it. she said. I didn't say a word. I walked straight to the guest bathroom, turned the shower on as hot as it would go, and sat under the water for an hour. And as the feeling slowly returned to my frozen hands, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't just going to divorce her. I was going to dismantle her. I was going to leave her with nothing. What Sutton didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I had already started building my case 3 months ago, right after the vase incident. I told you I have an obsessive memory. I remember everything. I noticed the small things, like the fact that our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, had installed a new high-definition security camera pointing directly at his driveway. A camera that had a perfect, unobstructed view of our backyard, and our back door, and the shed. The day after the lockout, while Sutton was at work, I brought Mr. Henderson a bottle of scotch. I told him we had some teenagers hopping our fence and asked if I could review his footage from the night before. He handed me the USB drive. I downloaded the footage. 2 hours of me freezing in a shed, completely visible, and clear footage of Sutton standing at the glass door, smiling and walking away. But that wasn't the weapon. That was just the shield. To destroy her, I needed a sword. And that sword came from my father, Arthur. Remember I said my father and I were estranged? We hadn't spoken in 4 years. He lived in a massive house in Boulder, sitting on a small fortune he made in commercial real estate. What I didn't know was that Sutton had been secretly visiting my father. I found out by accident. I was looking for our tax documents in her home office and found a toll road receipt for the exact route to my father's house. I dug deeper. I found her old phone in a drawer. I guessed the password. It was the date of her mother's birthday. I read the texts. Sutton had been visiting Arthur for 6 months. My father was dying of pancreatic cancer, and Sutton was playing the devoted, weeping daughter-in-law. She told my father that I was an abusive alcoholic. She told him I hit her. She told him I refused to visit him because I hated him. She played the victim so perfectly that my father, in his weakened, dying state, believed her. Her goal was simple. She wanted him to cut me out of the will and leave the estate to her, the battered wife who still loved his son. And it worked. My father drafted a will leaving his primary liquid assets, exactly $725,900, directly to Sutton Caldwell. When I read those texts, I didn't confront her. I remembered my grandfather's quote, "Wait for the teeth to align." Instead, I took a sick day from the clinic. I drove to Boulder. I walked into my father's house for the first time in 4 years. He was frail, sitting in a wheelchair, hooked up to an oxygen tank. When he saw me, his eyes went hard. "Get out of my house, you abusive piece of trash," he wheezed. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone. I played the audio recording of Sutton smashing the vase against her own head and threatening to frame me. I played the Ring camera footage of her locking me in the shed. I showed him the receipts for the men's clothing. I showed him the hotel keys. My father sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen concentrator. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw regret in his eyes. "She played me," he whispered. "She played both of us, Dad." We spent the next 3 days talking. Really talking. We healed more wounds in 72 hours than we had in 30 years. And then, we called his lawyer. My father passed away 2 months later. Sutton went to the funeral wearing a black designer dress, weeping beautifully into a lace handkerchief. She held my arm. She played the grieving widow to perfection. "I'm so sorry, Vance," she whispered to me at the graveside. "I know you two had your issues, but I'm here for you." I looked at her. "I know you are, Sutton." 3 days after the funeral, the hospital incident happened. The detonator I mentioned at the very beginning of this story. Sutton told me she was going to a medical conference in Colorado Springs. She was actually going to a ski resort with her affair partner, a man named David Gallagher. They hit a patch of black ice on I-25 and rolled her SUV. That's how I ended up in the emergency room, staring at a man wearing my winter coat. When the clerk handed me the fake ID, the one that said Mrs. Sutton Gallagher, I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just took a photo of the ID with my phone. I took a photo of Gallagher sitting in the waiting room wearing my coat. Then I walked up to him. "You must be David," I said calmly. He jumped, his eyes wide. "Who are you?" "I'm the husband," I said. I looked at my coat. "Keep the coat, David. You're going to need it, because when she wakes up, you're the only thing she's going to have left." I walked to the front desk. I signed the authorization forms as her legal proxy, ensuring she got the surgery she needed. I'm not a monster. I wanted her healthy. I wanted her fully conscious for what was coming next. I walked out of the hospital, drove home, packed 3 bags of my clothes, and left. 2 weeks later, the trap finally snapped shut. The estate reading took place in a high-end law firm on the 40th floor of a downtown Denver skyscraper. The conference room smelled heavily of lemon polish, expensive aged leather, and the subtle, peppery scent of the lawyer's aftershave. I sat on one side of the massive mahogany table. Sutton sat on the other side. She was wearing a rigid plastic neck brace from the crash, looking pale but victorious. She had brought her mother, Blythe, for emotional support. And sitting right next to Blythe was David Gallagher. Sutton had introduced him to the lawyer as her financial advisor. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. She brought her affair partner to my father's will reading. The lawyer, a stern man named Mr. Sterling, opened the thick manila folder. The stiff paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Arthur Caldwell," Sterling began. Sutton reached out and held Gallagher's hand under the table. She thought I couldn't see it. I could. "Arthur's estate includes the property in Boulder, which is to be sold and donated to the Denver Children's Hospital," Sterling read. Sutton didn't care about the house. She was waiting for the cash. "Regarding the liquid assets, totaling exactly $725,900, Sterling continued. He paused, adjusting his glasses. "According to the will drafted on October 14th, these funds are to be transferred in their entirety to his daughter-in-law, Sutton Caldwell." Sutton let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. She covered her mouth, squeezing her eyes shut as if overwhelmed by the generosity. Blythe patted her shoulder smugly. Sutton looked across the table at me. The mask was completely off. Her eyes were dancing with cruel victory. "I'm sorry, Vance," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Arthur knew how much you struggled. He just wanted to make sure the money was in responsible hands. I promise I'll use it to take care of us." I didn't say anything. I just looked at Mr. Sterling. This is the part of my job that people outside the medical field rarely understand. When you take an X-ray of a severe trauma, a femur snapped entirely in half, a shattered collarbone, a crushed pelvis, there is a fraction of a second before the digital image fully renders on the high-definition screen. The heavy machine hums, vibrating the floorboards. The cathode fires the electrons. The Bremsstrahlung radiation passes invisibly through the soft tissue, stopping only when it hits the dense, undeniable truth of the bone. The data compiles in the computer. In that microscopic window of time, while the screen is still black, the patient is almost always still holding on to hope. They are still hoping for a severe sprain. They are still hoping for a deeply bruised muscle. They don't know yet that their structural foundation has been obliterated, but as the technician, sitting behind the lead glass, I already know. I can see the shadows aligning in the raw data. I know the devastation is already there, written in calcium and marrow, just waiting to be illuminated by the backlight of the monitor. Sitting in that pristine conference room, breathing in the scent of the leather chairs, I felt that exact same deep, vibrating hum. The data was compiling. I looked at Sutton, really looked at her. I studied the slight, adrenaline-fueled tremor of excitement in her manicured hands. I noticed the arrogant tilt of her chin, restricted only by the plastic of her neck brace. I watched the way she subconsciously leaned her weight toward David Gallagher, completely and utterly assured of her own invincibility. She had spent years meticulously dismantling my reality, piece by piece, brick by brick. She had frozen me out of my own home, gaslit me into questioning my own sanity, humiliated me in front of my peers, isolated me from my friends, and stolen my dying father's final affections. She thought she had won the war. She thought I was just the quiet, pathetic man who pushed buttons and took the abuse. She had no idea the machine was already running. She had no idea the radiation was already passing straight through her, exposing every rotten, hollow space inside her carefully constructed life. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel betrayed. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt the cold, clinical detachment of a technician waiting for the image to load on the screen. The heavy, antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked off the seconds. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound was like a brass hammer striking an anvil, forging the moment into absolute permanence. I watched a single bead of condensation slowly slide down the curved side of the crystal water pitcher in the center of the mahogany table, leaving a wet trail on the polished wood. I watched a tiny speck of dust drift lazily through a sharp shaft of afternoon sunlight, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I wanted to memorize every single microscopic detail of this room. I wanted to trap this exact second in amber, because I knew that once Mr. Sterling opened his mouth again, the universe, as Sutton Caldwell understood it, would violently cease to exist. I thought about my grandfather sitting on his basement porch all those years ago. I could almost smell the fresh pine shavings curling around the toes of his work boots. A cornered dog doesn't bark. It just waits for the teeth to align. I had spent the last 8 months curled in the tightest, darkest corner imaginable. I had taken every kick. I had swallowed every insult. I had let her believe she was the apex predator in the room. But predators get sloppy when they think their prey is already dead. They stop checking their blind spots. I looked at David Gallagher, sitting there in his tailored Italian suit, completely oblivious to the fact that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were currently balancing on the edge of a razor blade. I looked at Blythe, radiating toxic entitlement, about to watch her prized daughter plummet from the golden pedestal she had built for her. The teeth were finally aligned. The jaws were locked open. All that was left was for the trap to snap shut. Sterling cleared his throat loudly. The sound broke the silence like a gunshot. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am not finished." Sutton blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "Excuse me?" Sterling reached into the back of the thick folder and pulled out a second, thinner document. The paper was bright, crisp white. The October 14th will was formally revoked by Arthur Caldwell 3 days before his passing. I hold here the superseding will, legally notarized and filed on December 2nd. Sutton's face dropped. The smugness vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, rigid panic. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Wait, what? He was on hospice in December. He couldn't draft a will. He was of entirely sound mind, ma'am, Sterling said coldly, his eyes narrowing over the rims of his glasses. And he specifically requested that I read his exact words for this addendum. Sterling looked down at the paper. To my son, Vance, Sterling read, his voice steady and formal. I leave my profound apologies for the years we lost and the entirety of my liquid assets, totaling $725,900. Blythe gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Gallagher instantly pulled his hand away from Sutton's under the table, shifting his chair back an inch. No, Sutton shouted, standing up abruptly, wincing in pain as her neck brace shifted against her collarbone. That's a forgery. He left that money to me. He knew Vance was abusive. He told me himself. Please sit down, Mrs. Caldwell, Sterling said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I will not sit down. I am contesting this. I have texts from Arthur. I have proof. Mrs. Caldwell, Sterling's voice boomed, echoing off the glass walls of the room. Arthur anticipated your reaction. He left a specific addendum regarding you. Shall I read it? Sutton froze, breathing heavily, her chest heaving. Read it. Sterling adjusted his glasses. To my daughter-in-law, Sutton. For your dedicated visits to my home, your impressive theatrical performances, and the night you locked my son in a freezing shed while you spoke to your lover. I leave you the exact amount of respect and loyalty you showed my son, which is nothing. Furthermore, any attempt to contest this shall result in the immediate public release of the security footage and audio recordings provided to me by Vance, which fully document your extortion, fraud, and infidelity. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that rings loudly in your ears. Sutton collapsed back into her heavy leather chair. Her face was completely drained of blood, as pale as a sheet of printer paper. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Blythe stared at her daughter in absolute horror, her jaw slack. Sutton, what did you do? I reached into my inner suit jacket pocket. I pulled out a printed 8x10 color photograph of the fake hospital ID I had taken in the emergency room. Mrs. Sutton Gallagher. I placed it face up on the mahogany table and slid it across the smooth wood. It stopped right in front of David Gallagher. By the way, David, I said calmly, leaning forward slightly. Using a fake name to secure emergency medical care under my insurance policy is a textbook case of insurance fraud. The hospital administration has already been notified. I believe the police will be speaking with you both shortly. Gallagher looked down at the glossy photo. Then he looked slowly at Sutton. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed violently to the floor. You told me you were divorced, Gallagher hissed at her, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. You told me the paperwork was finalized.